So if you are ready to start the multiplicity thing, you've got to start with the images downloaded to your computer. Step one is to open them all. So that's what we looked at in that slide a second ago. I recommend going to File, Open. You can open them all as a group if you select multiples at a time. But when you click Open, you should see each of your different images up at the top as different tabs. So if you flip through those, you'll see these are the different ones. I recommend making your empty background photo kind of your base layer and dragging all the other ones into that. I had someone ask me if it matters what order they do the mask in, if they mask and then drag the photo in, or if they drag them all in first and then do the mask. It doesn't matter, but I think it's easier to drag them all in first and then make the masks in one file. Because if I make any changes to this one, like let's just say I make my mask really quick and then I drag it over, when I go to close this later, it's going to ask me if I want to save, and I just don't like to hassle with that. So I'm going to show you the way that I would recommend doing it, but you can do it either way. So I'm going to flip through my tabs. I'm going to click, hold, and drag each image one at a time into my background file. And you should see them all starting to stack up as different layers in the same file. When you do that, it's important that you line each one up with the canvas because those should be lined up with each other. So I'm going to hide all my other layers and just make sure that the new ones that I drag in, I'm lining up with the canvas so I don't see any of those checkers around in the background. That should mean they're lined up. So I've got those two layers in. Once I've dragged an image in, I can close it. I'm going to drag my next one, click, drag, and drop. Line it up with the canvas. And once you've got them all dragged in, I would check what order they're in your layers panel, because there is a way to do it that makes life a little easier and a little harder. All right, so I see all these images getting stacked up in my layers panel. Dragging and dropping. Lining them up. All right, so I've got all my images dragged into one Photoshop file. They're all lined up on top of each other. I can tell because when I look at each one in isolation, there's no checkers showing in the background. They're all perfectly lined up with the canvas and with each other. So if I go through like this and turn one off at a time, I can see that they all line up pretty darn well. I recommend doing a save break at this point already once you've got your images in the same file together, just because you never know when someone's going to accidentally hit the power button on the computer cords and you'll lose your work. So do a Control S. Save on your H drive so you don't lose your work. I don't have an H drive. All right. So at this point, if you're doing it along with me or if you're just kind of watching, hopefully you have your images dragged into one file in Photoshop together. They're all different layers. The order of your layers, I strongly recommend having just your plain background as the bottom layer, and then stacking your layers according to either who's closest to the camera, if you're doing like a random, like there's just interactions. If you're doing a sequence shot, like where someone's doing a backflip or something, I would say have them in chronological order where your last motion is the top layer and you go back from there. So think critically about what order you have your layers in. The further back in the frame they are, the further down your list of layers they should be so that they naturally overlap each other. So like this one, if you're looking at my screen, he's in the middle seat on the table. The layer I have below him, he's in the back seat in the table. So this one, when I mask them, is naturally going to show up behind this closer one of him. So that's how I'm going through and organizing my layers, is how close they are in the frame, is how high up on the list they are of images. Perfect. Okay. I'm going to hide all my other layers and just show one so that for this first one, you can see the concept, and then we'll talk about some ways to kind of modify based on your photos. The basic concept is when you have an image with a subject in it that's not like your background shot, we just need to hide everything that is not relevant. Like we don't need this whole background 7 times. We just need the subject and then their shadow. So you can do even like a rectangle selection like this one. He's not overlapping the table. He's not overlapping any of him. He's just over here randomly. So I'm just going to use my rectangular marquee. I left out some of his feet though, so I've got to add those in. I'm going to hold shift and drag to get the tip of his shoes. But if you're watching, I'm not making any kind of complicated selection. It's literally just a rectangle around him and his shadow. But once I have that selection, that's when I make my layer mask. So all I got to do at the bottom of my layers panel is click that rectangle with the dark circle. And since I have all my other layers hidden, you can see what happens. It hides everything that was outside of my selection. So we've been doing this for weeks, but it's just a slightly different, application of this. Then when I show the next photo, I make that visible. It acts as the background for that one that we just masked the background away from. And that's how we see 2 clones together at once. We have 2 images overlapped, but the background on one is hiding, so it looks like they're in the same spot. This is why using a tripod and being careful about when you're taking your photos pays off, because you don't have to do any more work than that to get them to match up. It gets a little more complicated though when you have your subject interacting with something in the background like a table, casting shadows, or like interacting with other of their clones. So that's what I'm going to go through a little more carefully with my next masks. I'm going to zoom in so I can see a little better. For this one, I might just use the lasso tool because I want to have a little bit more control here. Actually, I'm going to use a couple different tools. I'm going to use the object selection tool maybe and see if I can get just Logan's. That did a pretty good job. So I use the object selection tool to get most of Logan because I don't need the grass or the wall or anything, but I am going to need him and his shadow. So I'm just going to cast a little bit wider of a net. I'm going to switch tools. You all know how to do this, by the way. You just might not know, So I'm going to get my lasso tool, hold shift, and then I can add to my selection by dragging around him where he meets the table and also where his shadow is on the ground. And from there, once I've got a pretty decent selection, I can make my mask again. So I just click the layer mask icon, and that hides the background. So this is what my 2 subjects look like so far. This is what my masks look like. Nothing super special, but then again, when I turn the layer below them on, it stacks them into that scene. And they match up because I use the tripod. So again, this can be real easy as long as your photos were taken carefully. If you notice though, there's still going to be a tiny little bit of camera shake even when we try our hardest. Like if I zoom in, I can see this version of Logan. Like if you're looking on with my screen, I can see that the wall is like a couple pixels lower in this selection than the other one. That could have been maybe the tripod just got, blown a little bit by the wind, or the camera rattled a little bit on the tripod, whatever it might be. There's a couple things I can try. One, I can see if I can just move that layer to match up with those details like the wall. So I'm going to select that layer, the image thumbnail I've got selected, not just my layer mask. And I'm just going to, with my arrows, my arrow keys on my keyboard, just nudge that layer up a little bit. It only took me 3 clicks. It literally had to move up like 3 pixels. But now that wall lines up perfectly. So that's way easier than having to come in and try and mess with your mask because the photo was just like 3 pixels out of alignment. I'm going to look down the rest of that image and make sure there's no other obvious mismatches or seams. I can see down here the shadow is missing because that photo was like taken 3 pixels off or something. So I can either use like my clone stamp tool to fix that, just to clone in more. But I guess I'll do that really quick just to show. All right, so first I've got to make sure that this area is not going to get hidden when I go to clone. It won't look like anything's happening, but I'm making it white on my mask so that when I do clone, that part shows up. And now I'm going to use my clone stamp tool. If I could find it. There it is. So I'm alt clicking here and I'm just filling in that little piece of missing shadow because the photo was taken a couple pixels off somehow. Why is it not super opaque? Interesting. Oh, I think I know why. Maybe it was my layer mask. That's why. This is another thing to mention. I know this is tiny. No one's even probably going to be able to see this on the projector, but if you can see, when I tried to clone in to fill in this missing piece of the background, it's not as dark as the rest of it. That's because when I made that part visible with my layer mask, my brush opacity was turned down. So just if things aren't looking right in your layer mask, it's always good to check to make sure that you're actually working with pure black and pure white first. If you have like some version of gray, it's going to make your work kind of transparent and weird. Just holler at me if you have any issues with that. Okay, that was like a tiny little detail detour, but back to the rest of it. The concept is the same. Just go through each of your layers, figure out what you're going to need to be able to see still with your photo or your subject in the background, and make sure they're included in your selection. Anything that you won't need can get excluded and masked out. From there, once you make your initial selections and masks, you can always fine tune things. So once you've made your mask, don't forget you can go in with your black and white paintbrush and show or hide more of your photo. So I'm just going to get the last little bits of Logan here and the shadow that he casts on the ground. I actually don't need that part of the table. I need his shadow here, though. I also want that shadow under him there. Okay, so this is kind of a funky looking selection, but it makes sense because I have Logan where I need him, and I also have his shadows. So then again, I'm going to mask out the rest of the image and stack them up with these guys. Although, did I mask the wrong one? What's happening here? No. Oh, I didn't mask this one. That's why. Okay, so now I'm at the point where I can see 4 of Logan. They're matching up pretty well, and I didn't have to do a whole lot of work because the photos were taken pretty well. They match up, but just be cognizant of little details like walls, lines in the sidewalk, shadows, stuff like that. I'll come around and start helping folks that need it, so holler if you need anything. And I will be right there. Let me check in this camera. Yeah.
Which one of these are for this?
These don't fit any longer, actually, on the new camera, so you just have to use the SD card.
Okay.
So that is in this side. You're going to pop that open and just put the card in the left side of your computer. It should have a slot.
Okay.
So it'll go in like that. If it doesn't go in for some reason, just holler at me. I'll help. Either, if it's getting stuck or putting in the wrong way, or some of these are loose, like they just don't have the thing inside the computer that lets them do it. So I have a card reader you can plug in.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. All right. Do you have your work that we can check out? Let me come see. Let me just get this last version of Logan here. Also, folks, don't despair if some of your photos aren't perfectly aligned. Usually it's just a matter of like a couple pixels. You need to nudge them in one direction or the other before you do a full overhaul. So try that first before you have to go in and do some gnarly like retouching or anything with your masks. Oh, this is a good example. Here, where I have this Logan on the table with his head down, but I got some of the background around his hands here, but then it's blocking this version of him, so he's like a floating torso. This is where you'd want to come in on your layer mask and get real close to the subject. So I'm going to get my paintbrush with black, which hides more of the image, and I'm going to come in and hide that stuff I don't want. It's easier if you do this when you're making your mask initially rather than doing it by hand later, but I'm too lazy right now. Also, if you ever get confused what layer you're on or what thing needs to be changed, it's always a good idea to hide all of your layers and just make them visible one at a time so you can figure out which one's which. Again, I know it might be hard to, it's really hard to see on the projector, I realize, but there's times where the background, those seams is really sharp, like the lighting might have changed, the sun went behind a cloud. The best thing in those instances, I think, is to use a soft edge brush and just blend between the two images that don't, that the lighting doesn't fit. Because that'll usually make the transition between them soft enough that no one's gonna notice without you having to do any super heavy retouching or adjusting. All right, what's up? Yeah. All right, Nick, let me stop the recording and then we can go check out your stuff and I'll help those guys.